Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Create and Consume, a podcast about what we make, watch, and buy in the era of digital content. I'm your host, Austen Tosone. Growing up, I always loved a good story, and to temporarily escape your own reality and get lost in a good book is one of my favorite things. I would definitely say I fell off of reading for a little bit, especially in my early 20s, between running around New York City and really not thinking that I had any time to read, to surviving a global pandemic and feeling like I've totally lost my focus and ability to concentrate. I'm so glad that I finally found my way back into reading in my late 20s. So today I wanted to talk about all things books and reading, from how to make time to read to tips for staying consistent, and also where I get book recommendations. So if you're a bookworm, I think you're going to love today's episode. Also, I'm aware it is a mess behind me. If you can believe it, we are actually leaving again in a few days for another trip. So by the time you are listening to this on Thursday, I will actually be in Wyoming with Andrew and his mom. We are doing a little trip, just the three of us, to explore some of the national parks out there. So say a prayer for me that I haven't been eaten by a bear or mauled by a bison or anything like that. I feel like everything we're doing will be relatively safe, but you never know. You never know. Maybe by the time you're listening to this, I will be at a brewery post hike, just totally relaxed. But you guys can follow along over on Instagram stories if you want to see what we get up to on our trip. And I might also vlog. I did get approval from both Andrew and Cindy, so stay tuned for a potential YouTube video about this trip as well. Before we talk more about reading, let's do a little create and consume to talk about what we are making and watching this week. So, as far as what I'm creating, I officially announced my Etsy shop to you all publicly. So it is called The Bold Bride. You can search for it on Etsy. And I wanted to create a separate Etsy shop for all of the wedding templates and spreadsheets and forms that I created during my own wedding planning process that helped me feel so much more in control, so much more organized and on top of things than if I didn't have them. Because planning a wedding really is coordinating so many moving pieces between all the different vendors that you hire, all the different guests you're inviting, and it can be really overwhelming. So I've shared these templates with some friends. I've gotten some early feedback on them, and everyone seems to be enjoying them. If you are currently planning a wedding, definitely check it out. I will leave a link in the show notes and the description down below. I decided to launch my Etsy shop with 2 products to start out, and I will definitely be adding more to it over the next weeks and months. But to start out, I created my digital wedding planner. This is your basically all-in-one planning doc for Canva, so you can edit everything. You can create your wedding mood board in there, drop important contacts in there. There are even checklists of what to bring, like, to the bridal suite the morning of the wedding, places to put maps to show where you're taking photos, schedules for what time to meet. This saved my life the day of our wedding because I did not have a relaxing wedding morning. We'll talk about this probably in a later podcast episode because we're actually quickly coming up on our 1 year anniversary of marriage, which is, I don't even know how that happened. But because it was such a stressful morning, whenever someone had a question for me that I didn't have time to answer or that I was, crying and couldn't answer, I would just be like, it's in the binder, it's in the binder. And this is now, I've really revamped this since I created it for myself. I've added a lot of new features to it. I've made it fully editable and customizable. And currently, this is the best-selling product from my shop so far. So that is live. And the other product I launched with is a venue comparison spreadsheet. So if you are in the very early stages of wedding planning and you're trying to choose which venue you might end up going with, and you're touring a bunch of venues and you want to keep all of the information that you learn about each venue kind of straight and organized and in one place, this is a Google Sheet that has drop-down lists and places where you can add your notes. You can add what online reviews say. You can add things that you find out on the tour, like whether or not you can have open flame candles and how many bathrooms there are and things like that. So this just keeps everything all together in one place to make it super easy for you to pick the right venue for your wedding. That was one of the most stressful parts of the process for me, was making sure that we had the right venue in case of rain, which we had quite a lot of on our wedding day, and in case of, just ease of transportation, getting around, things to do in the neighborhood. So that ended up being something hugely helpful that I created for myself during our wedding planning process, and that now I'm selling as a template. It's been awesome using a different part of my brain just as a content creator, as an influencer. We get in the same rhythm sometimes of creating content, and it feels really nice to do something different and creative that's not necessarily tied directly to like my personal brand. So definitely check it out or send it to a friend who is getting married soon. Maybe one of the products can help them out. And as far as what I'm consuming this week, I am so happy to be back in love with TikTok as a consumer again. And I've stumbled across this series that is literally just my favorite thing right now. So it's this guy. His username is HT Hayes, spelled Haze. I will also link this in the show notes as well. I am watching him watch the High School Musical trilogy for the first time on TikTok. And let me be clear, this is not like a light time commitment type thing. This is like, I have probably spent hours at this point watching him watch it, because he'll do like maybe a 2 or 3 minute clip of some of the biggest scenes, and he'll film his reactions to it too. It is just it is so enjoyable. I don't know if it's actually his first time watching it or not, but I don't know. I'm just really loving it. And there's something about revisiting the High School Musical trilogy that just makes me feel like I'm 15, which is silly because I'm turning 30 so soon. But I don't know. I'm just really, really enjoying it. There's also so many parts of the movies that make no sense that it's like so funny to hear someone point out now, especially since I watched them so seriously when they first came out. But yeah, so that is what I'm consuming this week. I thought that one was just a little different from what I'm usually consuming, and I thought you guys would appreciate it. But that's what I like about the consuming section, is it could be something as niche as, like I said, this guy rewatching or watching High School Musical for the first time on TikTok, or it could be something as, widespread as like a new Marvel movie came out. I don't know why I said that. I probably wouldn't be at a new Marvel movie unless like a group of friends invited me. Moving right along from that, let's get into today's topic, all about reading and books. Now, in the last episode, we discussed me being in a style rut and the fact that I'm kind of actively trying to get out of a style rut right now. However, I was in a reading slump a few years ago, and I'm now on the other side of it. I actually have gotten out of my reading slump. So the last episode was a little bit more of like a work in progress type episode, and this episode is a little bit more like I've gotten to the other side of this thing, and now I feel comfortable and confident to tell you more about it and also give you some tips and strategies if you want to be reading more, if you used to read a lot and feel like you fell off of it, or anything along those lines. So when I first moved to New York City, there just didn't feel like there was any time to read. I would wake up early, I would go to work, I would come home from work, I would write blog posts, or sometimes I wouldn't come home from work right away. I would meet friends for dinner, I would go to events, often work related, like press previews or parties or fashion week things. And I just felt like I was constantly running all around the city and that there was barely any time to get reading done in my early 20s. So even though I read a ton growing up, I read a lot in high school and college, it kind of just felt like nice to finally have a break where I didn't necessarily need to be reading. So I feel like I would read the occasional book here and there. I was really into career books at the time, and I read books like The Career Code. I read like the Teen Vogue Handbook, the original and the reprinted edition. I was reading like Amy Odell's Tales from the Back Row. I was reading Girl Boss. I was reading Leave Your Mark, like lots of those early 2010s career style books. And I loved reading those when I had time, but it just felt like there were so many other things going on. And I mean, when you're living in New York City and you're like 22, 23, it wouldn't surprise me if you told me that you didn't necessarily spend a ton of time reading. And then when the pandemic came around, a lot of people got back into reading, I think, during that time. And I was so jealous looking at people on social media who seemed to be reading like I don't know, some people were reading crazy amounts of books, like 50 books a year, 60 books a year, 100 plus books a year. And the thought of even reading one book was just so overwhelming to me. I felt like my attention span was totally gone. I felt like there was just nothing left of me to focus on something that wasn't a screen for more than like 5 or 10 minutes because my attention span just felt so totally shot during that time. The first thing that truly helped me break the reading slump was to take the pressure off and not worry about what I thought I was supposed to be reading, but just to pick up a book that I actually really wanted to read. It sounds like such a simple shift, but I feel like for a while, kind of immediately post grad, I just felt like I should be reading career oriented books and self development books. And I still love those too for different reasons. But there are some nonfiction books that are like really helpful to have and to reference. I have a few back there. I have one that's called like The Entrepreneur's Handbook, that's really cool. I have one about basically a list of skincare ingredients. It's almost like a glossary of skincare ingredients. I have read both of those books, and they're both so helpful to reference if I ever want to look up anything in particular. Like The Entrepreneur's Handbook has a lot of information about forming a business, it has a lot of information about angel investing and how to go public if in the future I don't necessarily like see that for my company right now. I'm obviously one person, so it would need to really grow and scale a lot in the future. But the fact that I at least have a resource right there of exactly how to do those things if I wanted to is great. But it doesn't necessarily make for the most like cozy, inviting, like, let's go sit and read for an hour. It's like that kind of sounds like a lot of work. And you have to be in the right mindset to want to read something that's a bit more dense and a bit more tactical. And so the first thing I did was really just remove the pressure to read things that I thought I should be reading and start to reincorporate things that I also really wanted to read as well. And for me, that really began with just adding fiction back into the rotation. I used to love reading fiction growing up, especially like throughout middle school and high school. There are just so many core book series like The Amazing Days of Abby Hayes and The Beacon Street Girls. Like, I used to literally flip out and run to Barnes and Noble whenever those new books dropped. And I kind of missed that feeling of the excitement behind just wanting to know what happens next in the story. So for me, the first thing was to obviously keep nonfiction in the rotation. There are so many helpful career books and self development books that I've loved. I actually have a whole YouTube video about some of those books, especially like business books for influencers that I think are helpful. So I will leave a link to that video in the show notes and in the description, so you can go check it out if you want. But when I was getting back into reading in 2022 and early 2023, I found that alternating genres and at least trading off, like I'm reading one book that I think is better suited for work or to help me grow as a person, and I'm going to read one book for fun, just purely for pleasure, nothing else. That really helped me just continue to cycle through different types of books. And by alternating genres and by alternating, again, like fiction versus nonfiction, it just gave me a few different perspectives and a few different things to look forward to about reading. And I think even taking a break from some of the nonfiction stuff made me appreciate the nonfiction stuff more as well. If you've wanted to get back into reading but have just felt like there's too much pressure surrounding it, I would just start by looking up some of the current, like most recent fiction books that have fun stories behind them. I'll share some places that I get book recommendations from later in this episode, but even just finding like kind of an interesting story, like I would recommend looking for a little description of a book that's almost like a juicy piece of gossip that you just want to know more about. Like, we just read one for book club, and the premise of the book, I'll talk about this a little later, was basically, there's this perfect couple, they're getting married on Nantucket, but the morning of the wedding, and this is not a spoiler, this like happens in the first minute of the book, but the morning of the wedding, they wake up and the maid of honor is found dead. So like, oh my God, like I need to know more. It's almost like as if someone in real life told me that story over coffee. If they told me that and then just like stopped talking and were silent, I would be like, but what happened? Like, I need all the details. Tell me everything. And I think if you can find a book that sparks your curiosity like that, that is definitely one of the best ways to break that reading slump and get back into it when you kind of just like need to know what happens. I think that curiosity and that intrigue is one of the best parts about kind of choosing what books you want to read and choosing your lineup for what you have on your TBR or your to be read list. That's kind of like a Bookstagram book talk lingo. I'm going to try to use it throughout this episode. Okay, so I feel like people have mixed feelings about the app Goodreads, and I like Goodreads. I just, in general, try to stay away from the reviews section because number one, sometimes there can be spoilers, and number two, I find that similar, to Yelp or Amazon or whatever, people either will leave like really, really glowing reviews if they really loved something, or really, really bad reviews if they really didn't like something. And there's not as much of a middle ground, at least from people I follow and books that I've read, that I notice on Goodreads. So I try not to tap into the reviews too much on there, but I do love Goodreads for two other things. Number one is helping me stay on track with how many books I am reading in a year. So they let you do a reading challenge where you can set it up at the beginning of the year and you can say, I want to read 20 books this year. And then as you go, and 20 books is my goal for the year, by the way, as you go and you kind of mark off the books that you've read in Goodreads, it will tell you whether or not you're on track. Now, this is obviously something you could track for yourself. For example, if you wanted to read 12 books in a year, then you need to be reading one book a month. But once you start to increase that number, I think it is helpful because Goodreads will tell you like, oh, you're one book ahead of schedule, or oh, you're two books behind schedule, so that you can see along the way as you're going where you need to kind of correct your course in order to actually meet your goal. So that's the first reason I like Goodreads, is because it lets you set that reading goal and helps you stay on track with your reading goal. And then the other reason I like it is because how sometimes, like in conversations, someone will say, oh, you should really read XYZ, like you would love this book. And you think to yourself, oh, that's great. Maybe you jot it down in your notes app, or maybe you look it up on a tab on your phone, but then it gets deleted later. With Goodreads, you can always just add books to your want to read list. So now anytime I hear something that sounds cool, like a book that I would want to look into, whether it's a friend telling me or I hear it, on a podcast or a YouTube video or anything like that, I can just simply add it to that list and I have everything now in one place. So if I don't know what to read next, I can just head over to that list and see if there's anything there that appeals to me. You guys can also feel free to add me on Goodreads. My username is Austen Tosone, which is the same that it is everywhere. Now, the next thing that I feel like is the number one excuse for why people don't read, and I'm totally guilty of this as well, so I say this like having been there, is that there's no time. Right? Like, I'm too busy to read. There's no time. When would I read? And it has taken me intentionally carving out time in my schedule to read, to really stay on track with my reading goals and to keep moving forward. So I thought I'd just share a few kind of key times throughout the week or throughout the months of the year, if your reading goal is within a year, that I try to intentionally set aside for reading. So number one is a couple of weekday mornings. And if you guys listen to my morning routines episode, I will link that one in the show notes and in the description box if you haven't gotten a chance to listen to that one. I talk about setting aside some time intentionally in the mornings to read before I start scrolling, before I start working, before I really do anything else. And as someone whose job requires them to be online and plugged in and tapped into social media and the internet for most of the workday, essentially, I really like having this chance to not worry about that as soon as I wake up. For me, I would so much rather get up, make a cup of coffee, sit down and read, even if it's for like 10 or 20 minutes. Ideally, it would be more for like 30 or 45 minutes, depending on how early I get up. But even if it's just to do that a little bit before diving into the whole chaos that is the internet for my job, which I created for myself, I just really like having that little bit of time to not look at a screen and get lost in someone else's work and someone else's story. That's not necessarily like someone else's actual Instagram story or something that is pressing or urgent or timely out in the world. It's just a story that kind of exists in like a different world. And I like spending time in that world before I enter the actual world that I live in the mornings. So even if you find yourself with like an extra 10 or 15 minutes in the morning, try putting it towards reading. I think you might be happily surprised at how differently you feel spending that time, actually reading versus just like scrolling on your phone or doing something that you might not need to be doing anyway. Another time I really enjoy reading is on the weekends, especially if it's a nice weekend here. I love going out to like the Hoboken waterfront or a park or just meet up with a friend or something and read outside if possible. That is something that I just totally enjoy and I really get like lost in a book. If it's not a nice weekend, kind of just making a cozy atmosphere for yourself at home, snuggling up under a blanket, sitting by the fire, making a cup of coffee or hot chocolate or whatever it is that you want and curling up with a good book, just setting the tone and setting the atmosphere for making it a cozy, happy place to be always makes me actually want to read because I'm like, oh, this is perfect reading weather if it's pouring rain, or oh, this is such a cozy time to pick up my book if it's snowing. So I like that reading is also an all-weather activity. Like if your plans get rained out, then you could always be reading. I also like to read when traveling, depending on how tired I am, like what time flights are, how we're getting around, if we are actually renting a car and need to be paying attention to directions and things like that versus when we were in Amsterdam, we took a 2-hour train from Amsterdam to Brussels. So, like, that's a better time to read than when you're trying to look at the Google Maps, look at the car, look at the road signs in somewhere that you're not familiar with. But anyway, so obviously, also during flights is a great time to read because there is no distraction. You can just pick up your book, get reading. I recommend noise canceling headphones for the airplane just because you never know. But I actually do get a lot of reading done also in airports, especially if you get like delayed or you have to wait around for things. If you don't want to like totally drain your phone battery, it's just so nice to have something else to entertain you that doesn't need to be your phone, especially if you want to save that for the plane. So I definitely think it's possible to read when traveling. Also, if you're going somewhere relaxing, wherever you're going, like if you're going to a beach vacation, that's a great time to bring a book. If you're having a bit more of an active trip and you're going to be up and moving around, you don't really have downtime, I think it's still nice to bring for like the airport, the plane, the Uber, the train. Didn't mean to rhyme that, but you know what I mean. And obviously, paperbacks are ideal because they're going to weigh less, but a good hardcover book too. You just have to be willing to travel with it. And on a similar note to that, to any fellow city dwellers or people who use public transportation to get to work, reading on your commute is another good one. For New York City, the subway is underground. You do still mostly have access to your phone, but if you wanted to like watch something on your phone and you keep hitting the buffering, like, just it's not my favorite thing to do when I'm on a train. I actually haven't been reading while commuting lately because I'm so addicted to podcasts currently that if I am like on public transit somewhere, there is a 95% chance that I'm listening to a podcast right now. But I know plenty of people who read on commutes, and I've done it before too, especially if you have a long commute that you just are dreading or you're not looking forward to. That could be a really nice way to reframe that mindset and kind of get some time back in your day while you are commuting. Okay, now I need to pause because I have 2 questions for you all. So you can tell me on Instagram, you can send me an email, whatever. Number 1, do you guys like audiobooks? Because as much as I love podcasts, I am wondering if I have the like stamina to withstand an audiobook just because I know that a lot of them can take 10 or more hours to listen to, depending on like the length of the audiobook. But I have some included in my Spotify subscription. So I'm wondering if I should just bite the bullet and try to listen to a book. So if you enjoy listening to books or you have any specific audiobook recommendations, please let me know. And number 2, I also want to ask if any of you are Kindle users. I obviously know what a Kindle is. I totally see the benefit of a Kindle and the appeal of a Kindle. I myself do just love holding a physical book, but I feel like I could read more with a Kindle. Obviously, that is so easy to travel with. It's easy to read in bed with. It just makes reading really easy and accessible. I totally get it. But let me know if you have a Kindle and if you like it and like what what the benefits of a Kindle are other than the fact that it's super portable. I've heard people discuss Kindle Unlimited before. I don't really know anything about that. So feel free to fill me in if you're passionate about this. Okay, and here are a few other things that have really helped me keep accountable and keep on track with my reading goals, in addition to, just setting a reading goal on Goodreads at the beginning of the year and doing my best to follow through with it each month. One thing that has actually made kind of a big difference has been getting my library card. I, first of all, used to love the library growing up. I would be at the library, I don't know, I feel like at least twice a month, if not more than that. I absolutely just loved browsing all of the books. The kids section at the library that I went to growing up was also so nice. We also had the best children's librarian there, Mrs. H. I always think about her when I think about libraries. And I just loved the concept of being able to borrow books whenever you wanted, as long as you return them in a timely fashion. So shout out to all the libraries out there. I know that it's so tempting to like purchase books now and have ownership over a book, but first of all, in New York City slash Hoboken slash if you live in any city of any kind, in an apartment, I'm assuming storage is relatively limited. As you can see behind me, our bookshelf is stacked and it could be even more stacked, but I'm trying to maintain like some element of display and decor back there. I like having the picture frames. I like the faux plants. Like, I feel like there needs to be dimension to a bookshelf beyond literally just holding books from a style perspective, but obviously that's just me. And I don't necessarily want to own every single book that I read. I always feel good when I buy a book and then I end up loving it because it makes me feel validated in my choice to purchase it. But sometimes there are books that you just don't necessarily want to read, or maybe you read and you don't totally love. So having a library card just gives so much flexibility for that. And honestly, there's also so much you can do online now too. I can, for example, go on the website for the Hoboken Library. I can enter, my card number and I have a little passcode and I can browse books. I can see exactly what is already in stock or what I would need to request. I can submit requests all online. I barely have to talk to anyone or go out of my way or do anything crazy. It's just so streamlined and so easy. Not to mention, depending where you live, your library might be part of a network of other libraries. So actually, I don't totally understand why Hoboken is part of Buckles, which is the library system that I had growing up. But because we're in Hudson County and that other group is primarily for Bergen County. But anyway, so Hoboken is part of Buckles, which is the Bergen County Community Library System, I think. So if I wanted to request a book and Hoboken didn't have it, they can put requests out through that thing to all of the other libraries, see who has it, and deliver me that book from a different library. So I've gotten books from libraries all over northern New Jersey, and very rarely have I gotten a book that actually has like the Hoboken Library stamp on it. So it's cool to know that I have access beyond just my immediate neighborhood. This can be helpful because if you want to borrow things like that just recently came out or newer releases, again, if that specific library doesn't have it, they can put out a call to all the other libraries and you'll get the book faster than if you were just dependent on that one place's inventory to receive your book. So we love to see that. Also, I was on my Hoboken Library website and you can borrow so many things from the library. They also have, I think it might be called actually the Library of Things on ours. You can borrow like cornhole, you can borrow filming equipment, you can borrow so many different things from there. So just reminder, if you are thinking about getting a library card or you've been meaning to get one, go get one because there's a ton of stuff that libraries are doing beyond just lending out books, including, lending out these different things, including programming. It's very cool. So shout out to all the libraries and librarians out there. Something else that has helped me stay on track with reading and that I've really been enjoying this past year is joining a book club. So I basically joined this book club I guess it was last November/December. I was at an event with some friends who are also content creators, and they were talking about this book that they were reading for book club, Lessons in Chemistry. And I was like, oh my God, I just finished that. I couldn't go to that first meeting, but I had read the book and I was like, oh, okay, if that's the kind of book that this group is reading, then I definitely want to be part of it. So I started with them. I read the first book in December of last year. We read, I believe it was Winter Street by Ellen Hildebrand, and we just really enjoyed that one. It ended on a cliffhanger, and I would have kept going. Maybe I can actually borrow the books from the library because I had purchased the first book and I was like, wait, what? It ended on a cliffhanger, and I didn't realize it was a 4-part series. So I was like, wait, what happens next? So I might still maybe, once it gets a little colder out, like set the mood, for a bit of a seasonal read, go rent out like Winter Street, whatever the follow-up books were to that, because we really liked it. But I love that our group kind of specializes in contemporary fiction. I feel like we primarily read books by female authors, which I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I personally love, just because I love hearing stories from the perspective of women. And we've definitely read things in the last few months that I wouldn't have necessarily known to pick out for myself or seek out on my own. I feel like my favorite version of a fiction book is basically like a romantic comedy, but in book form. So I like romance stories, I like love stories, I like seeing how people come together despite obstacles or differences or other people in their lives. But because I'm in book club, we have also read books that are more kind of nuanced stories. Like we read one called Mad Honey earlier this year that I really loved, actually written by my former professor from Barnard College, Jennifer Finney Boylan, and she co-wrote it with Jodi Picoult. And that book there was a love story intertwined in it, but it was also a story about parents and children. It was also kind of a mystery story. It had, a kind of small town murder in it. So it was kind of figuring out like what happened exactly and unfurling that. And it was just a really interesting story from all perspectives. I should have guessed the twist in the middle of the book, but I did not. So shout out to them for not giving that away right away, because it made everything so much more interesting once I realized what the twist was. And then we also read another thriller earlier this year called First Lie Wins. And I think I would have been maybe just more scared or something to pick up a thriller or mystery. I guess it was maybe more of a mystery. It wasn't necessarily like running screaming. It was a lot more like peering around corners, like overhearing things. So it was a little more suspenseful in that sense. But I thought the suspense was really well done. Again, I thought that one, the way it came together in the end, was so interesting and not something I really saw coming. So I enjoy reading things that, again, I wouldn't necessarily remember to look for on my own or think about when I have a whole list of, other like rom-com-y books that obviously interest me and that I would like to read next. So I would highly suggest looking for like a couple of friends who might want to read some of the same books as you. I feel like we're in a good cadence of how often we meet now and everything, and the books we choose. We basically just vote. We share books that we've noticed or seen recently that look like they would be fun to read, and we just vote on the one that we all want. There's 7 of us, so there's always a tiebreaker. And yeah, it's a good sized group as well. Like at this point, I feel like we are primarily able to pick a day and kind of stick to it with occasional exceptions, but it's a nice way to stay accountable and a nice way to hang out with friends and read new books. I also don't necessarily follow any like book specific Instagram or TikTok accounts, but I do follow people who are readers who will just occasionally share what they're reading, usually primarily on Instagram stories, if anything. 2 people who came to mind were Tomi. Her handle is Good Tomicha. She posts lots of books and usually shares her reviews and what she thought of them. So I primarily look to her Instagram stories for that content. I think she might also have some reels now as well, if I'm remembering correctly. But again, her content is not 100% books focused, but I just like when she throws out a recommendation, I will make note of it. I also follow Brooke Michio. She usually does book reviews on her Instagram stories too, and also in her YouTube vlogs, she'll show if she's reading a new book and kind of give a little synopsis or how she's feeling about it when she reads. Aside from following people like that, I also listen to a podcast called Bad on Paper. I'm sure I've talked about this on here already before, but that is one of my favorite podcasts in my weekly rotation. It's hosted by Olivia Mentor and Becca Freeman, both of whom are published authors themselves, and they often have authors on the show. They do book previews, like what they're most excited to read for each month or each season. They do what they're reading at the end of every episode if they've read anything that week. So that is definitely a place where I look for recommendations. And they also do book club podcast episodes on the last Wednesday of every month, I believe. So if you can't find a book club locally, I would strongly suggest just like listening to their book club episodes and reading what they suggest. You can go back and see if they have episodes for a book that you're interested in reading. I would say they often do a lot of contemporary fiction. I think their most recent one was Margot's Got Money Troubles, which is definitely on my TBR, my to be read list. I really want to read that one because the plot is just so different from anything else that I feel like I've heard of lately. If I'm remembering correctly, this girl, Margot, she might be in college and I believe she gets pregnant, but she decides to start an OnlyFans account to make money to support herself and her child. And I think her ex stepfather like gives her pointers about, I don't know. I feel like it's not as creepy as it sounds because everyone truly loves this book. And I'm just curious like how this whole thing unfolds. So I actually have it on my library want to read list. I think I'm going to request a copy from the library when we get back from Wyoming, assuming, like I said earlier, that I haven't been mauled by a bear on this trip. Another thing that really keeps me reading and gives me things to look forward to is when I find an author I like, and then I can just go read like their whole back catalog, or I can look forward to whatever their next release is going to be. So some authors I have discovered in the last, I would say like 2 years or so, and these are not like secret authors. Okay, these are very well-known authors who I just happen to personally like. So I'm not discovering anyone totally underground or anything here. I'm just sharing these as a general basis, but a few authors I really like. Number one, Carly Fortune. I have read all three of her books, and I saw she just announced her fourth book, which I'm really excited for because the fourth book is going to be from the POV of a character from the first book who was, I would call him a main character, but he was a little bit on the side of the main romantic relationship in that book. Lots of people loved that character and were asking for like his story to be told. So now she is doing that for her fourth book. We also just read her third book, This Summer Will Be Different, for book club. And I was so happy the girls liked that one because I suggested it because I love Carly Fortune. And now some of them have said that they want to go back and read her other books too. So when you do find an author you like, to go back and read like the other books that they've written before, I just think that is an easy way to say, yes, like this writing, like these characters, or like this world, let's keep going. And they don't necessarily need to be like sequels or part of the same story. But again, if you like someone's writing and the way they tell stories, then you might like their other stories, regardless of the setting or the characters. We also now have read 2 Ellen Hildebrand books for book club. I mentioned Winter Street already, which we read for December of last year. And we just read The Perfect Couple for book club for August because the TV series is actually coming out in September. So it's cool that we were able to read that ahead of the series coming out. We haven't met for book club yet to discuss this one, but I think my favorite thing about an Ellen Hildebrand book is it flies by. I got this one from the library and it was so thick. I didn't know how I was going to get through it. And I ended up reading it in a week. So even if it was 400 pages or a little more than 400 pages, I think, it still went by quickly because that's just the kind of book that she writes. So if you're looking for page turner, something to keep you moving and something that won't drag on for a long time, I really like her writing for that. And I also wanted to shout out Emily Henry. I talked about her book, Book Lovers, in the Create and Consume section of a previous podcast episode. I just recently finished it and really liked it. And she has lots of other books out as well. So that's another author where I read this one and I really liked it. So I want to go back and check out Happy Place, Funny Story, I think is her most recent one. So the fact that I liked those books and that I know that I will probably like the other books gives me a lot to look forward to on the list of books I want to read. I had a little list at the end here for like some recent reads that I've liked, but I've pretty much touched on every single one of these since we have started talking. I did write down Such a Bad Influence, which I believe I also mentioned during the Create and Consume section of a previous episode. That's a good one to read if you are interested in social media, especially how like parents post kids online, what happens to kid social media stars when they grow up, et cetera, et cetera. That one is by Olivia Mentor, who I just said before is the co host of the Bad on Paper podcast. And then a nonfiction rec that I read earlier this year was Steph McNeil's Swipe Up for More. She wrote for BuzzFeed for years, and I believe she's an editor at Glamour now. She wrote this book following 3 influencers, like IRL, and profiling them over the course of either 1 year or 2 years. I can't quite remember, but she basically followed these creators over the course of many years to really show like the behind the scenes and the day to day of what it's actually like to be a content creator. And I found it really interesting, obviously, as someone who works in the industry. But if you enjoy good writing and you're just curious about social media, influencer culture, any of those things, that could be one to pick up as well. Now, you must let me know what you guys have read so far in 2024 and if you have a 2024 reading goal and how far along you are. So be sure to leave a comment over on Instagram or TikTok. It's at Create and Consume Pod and tell me everything. You can also send me an email, createandconsumepodcast@gmail.com. And allegedly, you can leave comments on a Spotify podcast episode now. I haven't seen anyone do it yet, but maybe someone will. So any of the ways that you can usually reach me, fill me in and let me know what we're reading and what we're liking this year. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. As a reminder, you can support Create and Consume for free by doing any of the following. You can leave us Apple and Spotify ratings and reviews. You can like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you're watching me here on YouTube. You can follow along at Create and Consume Pod on Instagram and TikTok. You could send this episode to a friend who might like it. And of course, you can head to createandconsumepodcast.com for episode recaps and more. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.